Olivia had good reason to scream, as when I quickly reached her room she was hiding under her bed from the figure that was sitting at her little table and seats where she has tea parties. I swallowed hard as I approached the figure. But when it turned to me I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Baron Samedi. I sighed, bowing a bit to the voodoo Loa and ushering Olivia to come out from under her bed. Showing her that everything was okay. She poked her head out further and carefully slid out and ran to me. She hugged my waist and buried her face into my dress. "Bonjour, madam. Seems you've had a little run-in with the cockroach." He chuckled in his shrill voice. He got up and removed his top hat to me. I nodded and patted Olivia's head as she whimpered audibly. I guess her notion of King Creole being her friend has finally been shattered. Which is just fine by me. He said that the two of you have a deal with each other, I said with a tone of betrayal. He had been the one to decry King Creole as nothing more than a cockroach and had seemed more than delighted to drag the undead voodoo king back down to hell where he belongs. So why would he let him go? I wouldn't call it a deal with him. It's a deal with his mama. The Baron chuckled, pulling a cigar from nowhere and chomped his disgusting yellow teeth down on the item. Lighting up the item he puffed on it for a good few seconds before finally finishing what he had been saying. His mama had a change in heart and wanted her sonny boy back up here. So I looked the other way in exchange for a little tribute from him. He shrugged, tapping his cigar and dropping ash all over my floors. You can't do that. He was dead and buried, he shouldn't be allowed to roam any longer. I pleaded to the Loa, but he just looked at me and raised a brow, taking the cigar out of his mouth and blowing a disgusting cloud of smoke into my face. I could say the same of you, bitch. You shouldn't be alive neither, and yet here you are. Walking and talking to me. He snuffed, placing the cigar back in his mouth and continuing to puff away. He had a point. I might as well be the same age as Creole is, and yet I walk around as if I haven't aged since I first walked into his dreadful shop. Monsieur Baron, please. There has to be something you can do to save Travis. I begged from him. At Travis's name, the Baron looked at me with a puzzled look and removed his cigar. Travis. The loose end? He asked me. I looked up at him in a bit of confusion. Travis is certainly a lot of things, but I've never exactly considered him a loose end. Whatever that meant. I simply nodded since I just hoped that it was my Travis we were talking about. I see. So that's how the cockroach shit is walking around without a body. He just took one over. The Baron nodded to himself. Yes, I butted in quickly. He's taken out Travis's soul and has the body all to himself now, I said. This revelation greatly interested the Baron, who nodded and stroked his chin with his gloved hands. I see. I see. Tell you what, girlie, get me both of that boy's souls and I'll see if I can't help him some. He nodded with a chuckle, reaching a hand out to shake mine. But I refused his hand. Instead, nodding a verbal agreement. I've dealt with voodoo long enough to know to never agree to a concrete agreement. Just before the Baron left he took a look at the doll that Olivia was clutching for dear life. He got down on her level and beckoned for her to come to him. Olivia whimpered loudly as she gripped me for dear life. But slowly I coaxed her into going over to the voodoo Loa. Let me see your dolly. I promise I won't hurt him. He chuckled. Olivia looked down at her template doll and carefully handed him over to Samedi. He took the voodoo doll and examined it. His eyes opened ever so slightly the more he looked at it. He gave a happy giggle and handed the doll back to Olivia. That little thing has a mighty big secret. He chuckled as he disappeared into a cloud of smoke. I hugged Olivia as she came running back to me. Rubbing her back I looked down at the little template doll. Why was he suddenly getting so much attention? It's true that he certainly is an odd one. Unlike the other dolls I used to talk to in the shop, the template never talks about his former life. He's like a vault in the way that he never opens up about himself. What could the Baron mean in the template having a big secret? Deciding to leave Olivia at home by herself was one of the hardest decisions in my new life. I could have left her with a sitter, but I trust her more by herself than her with a stranger. She is safer there than being anywhere near the voodoo store. While that puts me in danger without her to protect me from King Creole, it's worth it as long as she stays safe. Leaving her with food and a tight hug and a kiss, I went off to the voodoo store. Knife in purse and nothing more than my determination. Arriving at the store my heart sank to the floor seeing that after so long, the half-priced voodoo store was now open again. I approached the door and peered into the glass. Seeing Creole in Travis's body talking to a new customer. I took a deep breath as I entered the store. Both of them stopped mid-conversation and looked at me. Creole kept his outward smile, but I knew he was furious at me. Like he usually is. The customer, however, just shrugged and went back to talking to the voodoo salesman. Like I was saying, I was hoping you could get rid of my ex-wife. The bitch is sucking me dry of alimony, and I want her gone. The man said, leaning on the counter and looking at Creole like he was going to save whatever poor life that he was living at that moment. What? Oh, yes, of course. The Voodoo King chuckled, fixing his tie and patting the counter free of dust, sending the man sputtering and coughing. Creole smiled and reached behind the counter and pulled out a notepad. I simply need her details. Name, address, blood type, that sort of stuff. He said with a chuckle and handed the man the notepad. He stopped coughing and looked annoyed at Creole, but took a pen from his pocket and began scribbling on the notepad. Muttering to himself and finally ripping the page and handing the scrap to the Voodoo King. Creole took the paper and crumbled it up in his hand. A puff of smoke coming in between his fingers. When he opened up his hand, nothing remained of the paper but ash. And it is done. Creole hummed as he blew the ashes into the man's face. She sputtered again and stared at Creole with nothing but anger in his eyes. But he simply turned around and walked away. Muttering to himself and walking past me. Rudely bumping his shoulder into mine and continuing without even saying he was sorry. Quite the charmer, I mumbled as I walked over to Creole. He stared at me with that grin and drummed his fingers on the counter. I took a deep breath and cracked my knuckles like I've seen cool people do on the Netflix. I want Travis's souls, I demanded. My. Look at you demanding something from me in my own shop. He hummed with acid in his voice. Standing up straight and reaching behind the counter. He placed the 2 bottles down in front of me. The blue soul still remained motionless, while the red one continued to fruitlessly smash itself against the bottle to escape. Why do you want them? He asked with a chuckle, lifting the blue one up and giving it a hard shake. None of your business. This is a business transaction. I have stated my desired product and you must give me what I desire. I said, clutching the straps of my purse tightly as I mustered up all the courage I had. You say it is none of my business. But darling, you're currently in my shop. Alone. With nothing but that little knife in your purse. What can you possibly do to me? He chuckled, taking the bottles back and placing it back down behind the counter. I huffed, knowing that he was right, but I still had an ace up my sleeve. Taking a deep breath, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the knife. He looked at me with a pleased smile and a giggle as I raised it up. Of course, he didn't expect me to throw the weapon at the wall behind him. Crashing into the bottles of souls and sending a couple crashing down. You goddamn bitch. He shouted, reaching up and grabbing a straggling soul and then another. While he was preoccupied, I jumped over the counter and searched behind it for the bottles. Only to come to the horrible realization that there was nothing there behind the counter. The sound of his chuckles left my blood frozen. You really didn't think I would have his souls out in the open, did you? He snickered as he shoved each soul back in its respective bottle and then back up on the shelf. I looked back at him and swallowed the bile building up in my throat. I was caught there with nothing to show for it. And in my horror, he gripped me by the shoulder and pulled me to the feet, spinning me around to stare at me with his button eyes. Seeing Travis's face with such anger and hatred towards me nearly broke my heart into a million pieces. The bell to the front door jangled and both of us looked over at the entrance. And my jaw dropped as Olivia struggled to push the door open. Finally, she quickly shuffled into the store, her little arms squeezing the template doll in her arms. Don't hurt my mommy, she said with all the courage a 7-year-old can have. Creole looked at her and then at me and snuffed, a long and annoyed chuckle coming from his throat. He pushed me away and towards Olivia. I stumbled forward and she quickly ran to me and hugged me hard. Why must you insist on bringing that thing here? Creole scoffed, his buttoned gaze looking down at the template doll in Olivia's hands. She pouted and let me go. Going over to him and pointing up at him with an accusing finger. He's the real Charles, she said angrily. You're nothing but a big bully who hurts people, she shouted angrily. My jaw dropped to the floor as I watched my little girl stand up for herself and for her doll friend. Although her words didn't really make any sense to me. Oh, is that right? He chuckled, reaching down and grabbing Olivia by her hair and yanking her up to his eye line. Gasping, I stood to stop him, but I was suddenly held back by the strings that once tortured and hurt Travis. They wrapped themselves around my wrists and kept me back. I'm not the real Charles, huh? And this stupid doll is, huh? He snorted, laughing, snatching the doll from her little hands and dangling it in front of her as she screamed. Let her go. I screamed as the strings tightened and began cutting into my wrists, drawing blood with how hard they were tightening. Creole giggled as he grabbed Olivia harder by the hair until he suddenly let out a grunt as suddenly dropped her to the floor. I watched as the little template doll stabbed Creole with a needle. The little doll then let itself go from Creole's grip and crawled up the Voodoo King's chest and up to his throat. "Get off me," he shouted, grabbing the doll only to be again stabbed by the doll, who then produced a razor blade from its mouth and in one swift motion sliced the stitches across Creole's throat. He gagged and clutched his throat as the black sludge that kept his body alive began leaking out of him. The strings around my arms let go, allowing me to run to Olivia and picked her up, the little doll latching to my ankle as I ran to the door. Creole clutched his throat as he stared at us run. I could feel the buttons burning into my skull as we ran from the shop. Seems Tempe, as he likes to be called, does claim to be the real Charles Sumner. Or more accurately, everything that he used to be. All the good that was Charles Sumner was placed into the doll, while the hatred and anger over his death was left to corrupt and decay into the horrible King Creole. I don't know if I believe him, but he saved my life. And even Creole and Samedi seem to know something about this little guy. I and Olivia will perform a seance with him to see if we can get in touch with the spirit stuck inside the doll. And maybe, just maybe, we can finally end the reign of King Creole.